Good morning. Welcome to Iron Sharpens Iron. My name is Jeremy Nettles. I am the evangelist for the River Ridge Church of Christ that meets in Newburgh, Indiana. If you'd like to come and visit us, you can find us at 5600 Van Road in Newburgh. We gather at 9 a.m. on Sunday mornings for our weekly Bible study. We have a worship service that begins at 10 and another one later in the day at 4 p.m. We also gather on Wednesday evenings at 7 for another installment in our Bible classes. You can also get in touch with us by phone at 812-550-6234 or over email, info@riverridgechurch.org. Those are great ways to get your comments or questions to us. We've been making up for lost time in the whole Bible series. This week, we're going to change genres and periods and purposes yet again. We're going to hop back to the Old Testament for a look at one of the more lighthearted, idyllic books of the whole Bible, Ruth. Now, I say that Ruth is idyllic, and I don't just mean that there's nothing dark in it. In fact, this is real life and real death, too. The situation presented in the book of Ruth starts out somewhat dismal. Let's read the first 5 verses of chapter 1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi, and the names of his 2 children were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. They lived there about 10 years, and both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. Not an auspicious beginning, if you ask me. To begin with, these Israelites are suffering from a famine back in this promised land, this land that flows with milk and honey, this land that God promised to the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and brought them there after 400 years of bondage in Egypt and 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. He crossed the Jordan with them. He led them with Joshua and defeated and drove out the nations of the land. They took it over. He allotted the land to the tribes. It seemed like everything was set to run like a top, and yet it doesn't. There's a scarcity of food, and that causes this family, led by their patriarch Elimelech, to leave and instead cross back over that Jordan River for a country inhabited by Gentiles. And that would be a bad start already, but then the patriarch of the family, Elimelech, dies. And that represents, more than just the loss of one particular guy. This is the loss of the family's moral center and moral direction. It's the loss of their chief provider, their chief protector. It also means there's a sort of a disconnect from the lineage, from Elimelech's father and his father's father, and so on and so forth. But, at least there are these 2 strapping young men who are themselves descended from Elimelech, and, they died too. In Elimelech's death, the family loses its connection to the past, to Israel, to God's promises, to the inherited wisdom of the generations. In the deaths of Mahlon and Chilion, they've lost their hope for the future. There are no more providers. There are no more protectors. There's no one left to grow into the new patriarch. There's no one to continue on the lineage. No one to reestablish the connection to this family's heritage, to Israel, to that land, to God's promises. Instead, we're left with 3 widows in an agrarian society that mainly rewards physical strength and manual labor. Things are not looking good for them. And yet, we're reading their story, so something worthwhile must have come out of all of this. But even if we were able to put those things together from the outset, the question remains, how will this happen? Whatever it is, how will this blessing come about? That brings us to verse 6. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. So Naomi decides to go back home. Why bother? First of all, they don't have any family, at least she has no family in Moab. That means there's no one to take care of her in particular. She does have some remaining family back home in Bethlehem. It's also not a culture full of safety nets and government assistance, so whatever is available to her to do that will help to take care of her, help to provide for her basic needs, she's going to have to pursue that. Things are not looking very good for Naomi and her two daughters-in-law in Moab, but there might be a chance of something better back in Bethlehem. Let's not deny that there's also a sentimental draw back to Bethlehem. Bethlehem is Naomi's old home. It's not just a sort of a temporary expedient, not just a stop along the way, as Moab had been. They moved their lives to Moab just because they needed to at the moment. It wasn't that they were deliberately trying to set down roots there and build a new life there and never return. No, the goal was always to go back home when the ability to do so arose. Let's read verses 8 and 9. But Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, Go, return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you in the house of her husband. Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. Well, we've discussed why Naomi would want to go home, but of course Orpah and Ruth aren't Israelites. Bethlehem is not their home. Their home has always been here in Moab. And that would be the chief reason that Naomi is sending them back to their parents' households. They're not going to reap any tangible benefits from Naomi, but they might be helped out by their families in Moab. Might. That's Naomi's prayer, though, that they will find help in their families and that they will each find a new husband. Naomi doesn't want them to be saddled with having to take care of and provide for her, and she would rather they move on to something more like the life that they would have expected. Now, as it happens, both of them, Orpah and Ruth, resist this for a while. Eventually, Orpah relents and turns back to go home. But Ruth? Well, there's a reason this book is named after her. Verses 16 through 18. But Ruth said, Do not urge me to leave you, or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you. And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. Why is Ruth doing this? We could go through a list of hypotheticals, but we would have to strike most of them for just not fully explaining it. The only thing that really explains Ruth's action here is very simple. She loves Naomi. And these other concerns, the travels, the different homes, the different peoples, the different gods of the Moabites and the Israelites, those are actually all secondary concerns in Ruth's mind to the devotion that she feels toward her mother-in-law. This is obviously not ideal that she considers the God she worships to be sort of a secondary concern to her relationship with Naomi, but well, she's not supposed to be perfect. She's growing, as are we all. So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab. And they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest. So how would you describe their outlook at this point? Well, it's not great. There's a major good point. They're back home, or at least Naomi is back home. But even though this is the case, there's still no one to provide for Naomi. She doesn't have a husband just by virtue of having returned to her hometown, and neither does Ruth. However, they don't necessarily have to find someone else to take care of them. The Torah, the law that God had given the Israelites, provided for the widows and the poor. We can see the relevant law in Leviticus chapter 19. Let's begin reading in verse 9. When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap your field right up to the edge, neither shall you gather the gleanings after your harvest. And you shall not strip your vineyard bare, neither shall you gather the fallen grapes of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and for the sojourner. I am the Lord your God. Deuteronomy 24, beginning in verse 19. When you reap your harvest in your field and forget a sheaf in the field, you shall not go back to get it. It shall be for the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow, that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. When you beat your olive trees, you shall not go over them again. It shall be for the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow. When you gather the grapes of your vineyard, you shall not strip it afterward. It shall be for the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. Therefore I command you to do this. they were allowed to glean from the fields, which is to say they were allowed to go in and take small amounts on an individual basis from certain parts, from the corners of the fields for one thing, and then also what fell on the ground during the process of reaping. And they have arrived at the beginning of the barley harvest. So even though there's not exactly a social safety net or a government assistance program, there is a law that allows these people, these poor, these widows, these sojourners, Ruth and Naomi fit all three of those, they're allowed to go into any field they wish and to take, as I said, small amounts of grain for themselves to eat. Now they can't go in there and harvest it. They can't go in there and start collecting it all up and beating it into flour and then selling that on the open market. That doesn't fly. But they're allowed to take enough for themselves. This brings us to chapter 2. Now Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him in whose sight I shall find favor." And she said to her, "Go, my daughter." So she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers, and she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem, and he said to the reapers, "The Lord be with you." And they answered, "The Lord bless you." Ruth is on a mission. She's going to take advantage of the law's provision and glean among the ears of grain. She's putting herself in a somewhat risky position. Out in the country, among a bunch of day-laboring men who may, A, take exception to her collecting up grain that they would get paid for if it ended up in their baskets instead of hers, and B, they might take liberties with an unaccompanied young woman out in the middle of nowhere. Still, she's eager to bring home food to Naomi. By chance, or perhaps by providence, she happens to end up, unbeknownst to her, in the field belonging to Boaz, the close relative of Naomi. And Boaz is one of the good guys. He finds out who she is, and then we come to verse 8. Then Boaz said to Ruth, "Now listen, my daughter, do not go to glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping, and go after them. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you? And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn." Then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your eyes, that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner?" But Boaz answered her, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land to come to a people that you did not know before. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." Boaz is impressed by the way that Ruth has treated Naomi, and he is willing to use some of his own resources to help her out. He goes beyond offering relative protection and access to precious water. He actually provides her with a lunch in verse 14, and when she goes back to work, well, verse 15. When she rose to glean, Boaz instructed his young men, saying, "Let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not reproach her. And also pull out some from the bundles for her, and leave it for her to glean, and do not rebuke her." Notice that he's not having them just hand over some of their grain to her or giving her a basket of it at the end. He's taking extra steps as if to conceal, even from Ruth, that she's getting this special treatment. All of this being the case, Ruth makes out like a bandit that first day, taking home about an ephah of barley at the end of the day. That's about a 5-gallon bucket full of grain. Even given that it hadn't been threshed yet and will result in a much smaller volume of flour for baking, that's a pretty good haul for a day's gleaning. That's at least 2 weeks' worth of food for Ruth and Naomi, and that's just one day. She gets to come back tomorrow. Ruth may still be in the dark here, but Naomi, on looking at the amount of grain she's brought home, can tell she's getting some help. She inquires whose field Ruth has been gleaning, and points out the relation when she hears the name. Verse 20. And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "May he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." Naomi also said to her, "The man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers." This word redeemer is pretty important. It and related words show up 23 times in this short book. 2 things are combining here. One is the law of redemption of land. God allotted the land of Israel to 12 tribes, and within the 12 tribes, to clans and to sub-families. It was supposed to remain within those particular families forever. but with provision made to allow the Israelites to sell their land temporarily. It's complicated, but we can get the relevant details in Leviticus chapter 25, beginning in verse 23. The land shall not be sold in perpetuity, for the land is mine. For you are strangers and sojourners with me, and in all the country you possess you shall allow a redemption of the land. If your brother becomes poor and sells part of his property, then his nearest redeemer shall come and redeem what his brother has sold. So presumably Elimelech, Naomi's since deceased husband, remember, sold his property to someone before taking off for Moab during the famine. Naomi now has every right to buy it back, even if the current owner/steward doesn't want to give it up. But she doesn't have the money to do this. Now, a close relative of hers does have the right, in fact the duty if he can swing it, to buy it on her behalf, bringing it back into the family. The idea would be that the family can come to some sort of agreement for how the perpetual owner can still work that parcel of land and get paid for it, but control of it would pass to the relative who bailed them out, at least for now, and that's really all that Naomi needs. Then there's a second type of redemption, and for this we turn to Deuteronomy 25. If brothers dwell together and one of them dies and has no son, the wife of the dead man shall not be married outside the family to a stranger. Her husband's brother shall go into her and take her as his wife, and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. And the first son whom she bears shall succeed to the name of his dead brother, that his name may not be blotted out of Israel. Well, that's weird, but again it has a lot to do with the land. This poor unspecified dead guy doesn't have anyone to inherit his allotted land, and so his name and his legacy will disappear. And especially if the widow marries someone else outside the clan, or else outside the tribe even, well, now poor old dead, I don't know, let's call him Aminadab, his land has been left to his widow, let's call her Hannah, and if she can't find someone else in the tribe of Issachar who's willing to marry her and has to settle for Shemaiah of the tribe of Gad, then he could take over the legal rights to Aminadab's land and pass it down to his Gadite sons, transferring the ownership of that field from one tribe to the other. And that's not what God wanted. So, to keep it as close to the original owner as possible, it's the nearest relative practical who has the obligation to marry the widow and aim to raise up a son who will be counted as the legal heir of that first husband. It's not clear that this legal obligation goes beyond brothers to cousins and such, but given that Naomi's husband Elimelech's land rights pass down to their sons, both of whom have since died, Ruth is left with that option, and she effectively shares that with Naomi. At the same time, if Mahlon and Chilion had had other brothers, they would have been obligated to marry Ruth and raise up offspring in the name of her first husband, as well as to redeem her land. So Naomi is looking for someone closely related enough to exercise these powers and provide for her and Ruth with relative security, and save the family line from dying with them. So, all of this being the case, chapter 3, verse 1. Then Naomi her mother-in-law said to her, My daughter, should I not seek rest for you, that it may be well with you? Is not Boaz our relative, with whose young women you were? See, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Wash therefore, and anoint yourself, and put on your cloak, and go down to the threshing floor, but do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. But when he lies down, observe the place where he lies. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do. Is this going to stay G-rated? Maybe PG, I suppose, but there's no reason for it to go any beyond that. Plenty of interpreters have read a sexual encounter into this instruction that Naomi is giving to Ruth. That doesn't seem to be the case. There's some obvious symbolism and a vaguely sexual suggestion, but not in an overtly immoral way, just that she's putting herself in a very vulnerable position, obviously so, and she's obviously saying that she trusts Boaz and wants him to be her protector in a more formal sense. So she does what Naomi has said, and that brings us to verse 8. At midnight the man was startled and turned over, and behold, a woman lay at his feet. He said, Who are you? And she answered, I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer. And he said, May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made this last kindness greater than the first, in that you have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask, for all my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman. What's this great kindness that Boaz mentions? Well, she's clearly desirable and could have just looked out for herself and looked for a similarly desirable young man to secure her own future. But instead, she has focused on him in particular, out of love for Boaz? No, for Naomi. And Boaz gets the politics behind it, what with the land and the legacy and all that stuff. He's very impressed with this woman, and he is agreeing to marry her, not because she brings any great benefit to him, but because she has demonstrated such sterling character. She joined herself to the people of God to take refuge under his wings, as Boaz said in chapter 2, verse 12. She's a hard worker, and not just to take care of herself, but of her mother-in-law, who provides, as I mentioned before, no tangible benefit to Ruth in return. She's willing to put others first, and she's willing to take substantial risks to do what her loved ones need done. Unmarried men, if you find you a Ruth, hang on for dear life. Boaz gives Ruth another gift in pledge of his agreement, and she goes home to Naomi. Of course, there's always a complication. In this case, there is a nearer relative than Boaz who has first right of redemption, and Boaz has to offer the deal to him first. Chapter 4. Now Boaz had gone up to the gate and sat down there, and behold, the Redeemer of whom Boaz had spoken came by. So Boaz said, Turn aside, friend, sit down here. And he turned aside and sat down, and he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, Sit down here. So they sat down. Then he said to the Redeemer, Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. So I thought I would tell you of it, and say, Buy it in the presence of those sitting here, and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me, that I may know, for there is no one besides you to redeem it, and I come after you. And he said, I will redeem it. Then Boaz said, The day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance. Then the Redeemer said, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it. There are a couple of ways to interpret Boaz's words and actions here. Everything lines up as we've established, but it seems odd that he's so careless about this decision. Sure, I'll marry you, Ruth, and buy back your land too. That will drastically alter the course of my life, but I should really offer the deal to my dad's cousin or whatever first. I'm inclined to think that, no, he's not being flippant about this. He's actually operating very carefully. He brings 10 witnesses along, and he makes the proposal in front of them and the elders at the city gates. That would need to be involved in legally authorizing the outcome regardless, but there's no reason he couldn't have just sought out his relative and asked him man to man, and then gone to the elders about the legality of it if that turned out to be needed. I suspect it's because this guy technically has the right to buy the land and ditch the women. Boaz is making it very difficult for him to do this by giving him an audience of people whose respect he would really like to keep. Once confronted with the whole situation, framed in the way that Boaz has carefully framed it, other Redeemer guy passes on the deal, clearing the way for Boaz. I suspect this is exactly what Boaz was really after, but he had orchestrated it so that even if he didn't get it, Naomi and Ruth would have had someone to take care of them. Nice guy. Verses 13 through 17. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And he went in to her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. Then the women said to Naomi, Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age, for your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him. Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her lap and became his nurse. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, A son has been born to Naomi. They named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Yes, that David. And not only that, in Matthew chapter 1, verse 5, And Salmon the father of Boaz by Rahab, and Boaz the father of Obed by Ruth, and Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David the king, moving down to verse 15, and Eliud the father of Eleazar, and Eleazar the father of Mathan, and Mathan the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who is called Christ. Ruth was not only David's great-grandmother, but Jesus' super stupendously great-grandmother. And that's really the point of Ruth. Just when it looked to Naomi like everything she cared about was dried up and lost forever, God used the most unlikely person possible to bring about untold blessing for Naomi, for Israel, and for the world. Just a handful of righteous, God-fearing people, one of whom, Ruth herself, is a rather new adopted member of God's family, acted with diligence and devotion and wisdom and love, and were blessed with a legacy far beyond land and offspring. Ruth demonstrates not only that the unlikeliest of people can be put to exceptional use in God's plans, but that the people you might have thought were off God's radar may be chosen for his rich outpouring of kindness. Ruth's own descendant would demonstrate this fully when he gave himself up on behalf of those he loved in a much more powerful display of service and sacrifice, bringing about redemption to all those who seek it. Naomi and Ruth and Boaz are all great examples for us to emulate in our own lives, and they can teach us plenty about how putting others before our own interests often leads to us being richly blessed as well. But the real takeaway from this book is in Ruth's simple, heartfelt, submissive, utterly vulnerable appeal to her Redeemer in chapter 3, verse 9. He said, "Who are you?" And she answered, "I am Ruth, your servant." She doesn't see her own value, only what this man may do for her, and her need to acquire it. And she opens herself up to him completely and throws herself on his previously demonstrated mercy and kindness, asking to take refuge in him. That's what God tells us we should do with his son. In Psalm 2, written by Ruth's great-grandson, we find at the very end, "Kiss the Son, lest he be angry and you perish in the way, for his wrath is quickly kindled. Blessed are all who take refuge in him." Do you take shelter under the Savior's wings? We're all in Ruth's position, with nothing tangible to offer God, and the prospect of seeing everything we care about drying up and dying away, including ourselves. And it only gets worse from there. We don't have a short period of hunger followed by something approaching rest in death to look forward to, but rather a fearful expectation of judgment and a fury of fire that will consume the adversaries. Why not instead resolve to put yourself under the power, authority, and shelter of the Redeemer and join his family? You can find part of that family at River Ridge, and we'd love to have you join with us. You can reach us at 812-550-6234 or info@riverridgechurch.org. You can also find us at 5600 Van Road in Newburgh. We gather at 9 a.m. on Sundays for Bible study, 10 a.m. for worship, 4 p.m. for afternoon worship, and again at 7 p.m. on Wednesdays for another study. We'd love to see you there. Thanks for joining me today on Iron Sharpens Iron.